That picture you see there is Thomas Jefferson, who you may have heard of, handing a piece of paper, and you might recognise Benjamin Franklin to his left. They wrote this proposal and put it to the Second Congress, and that's John Hancock he's handing it to, suggesting that the US, for various reasons, break away from Great Britain, because at this point they were just kind of an offshoot of Britain, still under the monarchy, and for various reasons, mainly actually because of taxation. The British had defended the colonists, if you like, from the French and other enemy nations, had allowed them to get a foothold in that land, but it left them out of pocket, and they wanted some coverage for that, and they sort of put their hand out to the eastern US states, at that stage that was it, that was the US, and they didn't really like that, and so then the British said, oh well, we're going to pass this law around sugar where you have to buy sugar from us at exorbitant prices, so it's just a form of taxation, and this ultimately led to war. So when they declared independence, they had not broken away. There was just an intent, and it was actually several years later, through the Revolutionary War, that they were successfully able to get, with the help of the French and the Spanish actually, get the British out, and they formed a peace treaty around that time. So this was, it's up there, 1776, so it's quite a few years later that they successfully broke away and became a nation. So that is commemorated today. I think that event you see on the screen there was, it's 28th of June, so it was a few days later, and they actually got it passed, signed off, and it was 4th of July. So that's how the US came to be. Now, we'll just recap. We just read this, but I'm just going to put up a couple of quotes. That's all we're going to cover, just to set the scene around some of these prophecies about Israel. One of them, as I said, we just read this. Suffice to say, so I'll just sort of paraphrase the prophecies about Israel. There are lots of them in the Bible. They're across multiple books of the Bible. They're extremely detailed, extremely specific, and you can piece together a very detailed tapestry if you draw upon all of them. We're just going to pull up two because we'd be here all night otherwise, just looking at quotes. But to paraphrase these prophecies, I would suggest to you that very specifically, centuries before Israel were scattered, which they were by the Romans in AD 70, undoubtedly centuries before, even the greatest critics of the book of Ezekiel will place it at 3rd century BC, okay? The most sort of way out critics of the book who ignore the evidence, 3rd century BC. So hundreds of years before Israel was scattered, Ezekiel said they'll be scattered, as did Jeremiah, as did various other prophets. And then, even if you want to doubt that dating, which nobody really does, about another 2,500 years later, it was fulfilled quite clearly when Israel was regathered back, or the Jews were regathered back into the land that we would call Israel, or some people would call Palestine. It's extremely accurate, extremely specific prophecy about a specific nation in a specific location being taken out, put back in. You couldn't fake it if you tried. That's the prophecy we're going to look at tonight. So Ezekiel is just one of many examples. All the house of Israel holy, nay to whom the inhabitants of Jerusalem. So this is just specifying it's about the Jews. Therefore, thus saith the Lord God, I will even gather you from the people and assemble you out from the countries where you have been scattered, and I will give you the land of Israel. Okay, very explicit. You'll be scattered, you'll be regathered, and it will be in Israel. That is where it will occur. Okay, very, very specific. As to this, I said I'm only going to look at two quotes. The second one is a little bit around the how. It's a bit brutal when you actually consider, as we will, how it was fulfilled, but that's what God always said would happen. How would this happen? I'll bring them again into their land that I give unto their fathers. Behold, or gave unto their fathers, sorry. Behold, I will send for many fishers, saith the Lord, and they shall fish them. And after will I send for many hunters, and they shall hunt them from every mountain, every hill, and out of the holes of the rocks. So what it infers, again, thousands of years, over 2,000 years before this ever happened, what this suggests is that the bringing back of the Jews into their land was going to be with some level of difficulty, because there would need to be fishing and ultimately hunting to get them back. Okay, so it's quite an explicit detail. It doesn't tell you how that's going to play out, but it just tells you that's what's going to happen. That'll be a characteristic of how it happens. So just keep that in mind as we sort of walk through the history this evening. Okay, so I've already mentioned, we're going to sort of start at the beginning and then jump forward about 1800 years pretty quickly, but just to set the scene, starting at the beginning, the scattering of Israel, okay? So this occurred, this is very clear in history, this occurred in AD 70. The Romans ultimately laid siege. It had been going on for a few years. AD 70 was the end. They besieged Jerusalem because the Jews, as they want to do, rebelled against their Roman overlords, and they dug in, went on for quite a period, but ultimately the Romans got through and they absolutely butchered the Jews, and it was horrific, and they scattered them, you know, as if to say, never again, we're going to kick you out of here because you are a rebellious people, which in a sense they were. And in a sense, they'd been rebellious against God, as they had been many times prior, in that they particularly had crucified his son about 40 years prior. Okay, so that's how the scattering occurred. And then various nations came in and occupied the land of Israel after that for over about 1,800 years, roughly. So the Romans obviously came in, then various Muslim powers occupied it, the Mongols, the Ottoman Turks, which is we're going to look at in a second, a whole list of nations, the British even after them, a whole list of nations occupied that land for that 1900 year period, but the Jews did not. They were not, as it were, able to get back in, perhaps didn't even want to get back in. Other nations occupied that land, and that was prophesied as well. Okay? Other nations would occupy it. And it got to a point, again, this is just a bit of context setting. This is a really old map, but I found it interesting. It's actually a German map, but it's from 1881. And what this map, I don't expect you to read it because it's in German and it's too small, so there's two reasons. But if you could read German and if you had really, really good vision, what you would see in the top left, well, you don't need to read German to read numbers actually, but what you can see, if you look very carefully, is that there's a key. And what this map does is it lays out in 1881 the percentage of the population of different nations that were Jewish. And so, you know, down the bottom, the red, I don't know why it goes from red to grey, but anyway, the red and the sort of browny grey are getting up towards 10%, in excess of 10, almost 10, 20% Jewish population. So the reason I put this up is because as time wore on, a better part of 2,000 years, and we get towards the business end of this prophecy, if you like, you see there's a bit of a problem, which is the Jews were not in the land in the 19th century, late 19th century, they weren't in the land. And in fact, they were pretty intensively in anywhere but the land, which was, they were in Europe. They were in Western Europe, Central Europe, Eastern Europe, Russia, that sort of area. Some parts of particularly Eastern Europe were quite intensively populated by Jews. So for the prophecy to be fulfilled, God, and they were settled, they'd been there for generations. Of course, there was quite a lot of wealth. You kind of look at it from God's perspective. He said that they're going to go to Israel. Why on earth would they do that? How is he going to pull that off? And at this point, of course, Israel is occupied by one of the latter-day occupants, which is the Ottoman Empire, the Turks. Okay, so you've got the Turks in the land. You got Jews quite settled in all over the world, in fact, but particularly Europe and Eastern Europe. And the prophecy doesn't really look like it's very close to being fulfilled. Okay, a little bit more history. Around this time, though, there was the beginnings of what was called the Zionist Movement. So various Jews and British sympathisers, like Lord Shaftesbury, you see there, in the middle of the 19th century, the Jews started a movement of Zionism, which was that they wanted a homeland, and particularly they were targeting the land of Israel. And there was sympathy, particularly from Britain, for two reasons. Some historians will certainly say for geopolitical reasons it was in their interest, because the Middle East is geopolitically important and significant, and having a level of control over Israel, if they got them back into that land, would be quite advantageous for the British, as distinct from having the Turks there, who they weren't that close to. So there was kind of reasons of self-interest, which is probably credible. But also there was this religious so Lord Shaftesbury is an example of this. There were Christians, Protestant Christians in England, who could read the Bible just like we did, and who had a perspective that the Jews would go back into the land. So in a way, they were kind of trying to make the prophecy self-fulfilling. So they did seek to influence the Jews, because they thought scripturally that is what would happen, and he was one example of that. Okay, but the problem was, the Turks were there. They were pretty powerful at this point. So that's Pasha. He was the leader of the Turks during World War I. And he was a senior figure in the lead up to that. And they were pretty entrenched, and they were not interested in giving it to the Jews. So at this point, again, it's lots of Jews in Europe, pretty happy, pretty powerful empire occupying the land. It's all looking rather unlikely. And then I just find this fascinating. Not everything we're going to look at is around the Americans. We are going to have a bit of a bias towards that, but some of the history here, it's nothing to do with the Americans, but it's just so interesting how dominoes started to fall around the beginning of the 20th century that would lead 50 years later, 40 years later, to Israel looking like they were nowhere near being back in the land, to being back in the land as a nation in 1948. Okay, and one of the dominoes, it's just crazy. I knew about this before I researched this, but I sort of looked at the details a bit closer, and it's so interesting. Some of you may know that the catalyst for World War I. World War I is all wars are crazy, I suppose, but it is particularly crazy when you look at how it came about, because it just seems to come out of absolutely nothing. This crazy, and it was a brutal, brutal war. It killed millions and millions of people. And it started with a Serbian nationalist who didn't like the Austrians. They had political differences. He and others decided to assassinate that man who was the heir to the Austrian throne, Archduke Ferdinand. And what they did was they had these old school grenades, bombs, and Ferdinand had telegraphed to people in Sarajevo that he was doing this procession, he was going to do a bit of a wave, and told everyone where he was going to go in an open-top carriage. So if you ever wanted to assassinate someone, this would be the perfect opportunity. And unfortunately, people did want to assassinate him. But the would-be assassins mucked it up in that they threw the bombs and they missed him. And they missed the carriage behind him in the procession, and they got the one behind the one behind him. Okay, and they blew it up, and that's actually that photo. So it was a foiled attempt at assassination. You think at this point, knowing of course what happened, he would ultimately be killed, and this would be a domino that would lead to World War I and the return of the Jews to the land, World War II and the return of the Jews to the land. You think, well, that didn't go very well. If the angels were orchestrating this, the angels of God were the puppet masters behind this, it didn't work. Well, you know what he did? Straight after this, he thought, because people were hurt and they were in hospital from the other carriage, he thought, I'd better go and visit them. So again, he decided to go to the hospital in an open-top carriage. He took a wrong turn, got parked outside a building, and one of the would-be assassins just happened to be there with a pistol in his pocket and pulled it out and shot him. That's what happened. So that sort of feels like the hand of God, perhaps. It just seems crazy. I mean, the luck, inverted commas, the luck of that for the assassin, but that's what happened. And he was shot dead. And that led to this insane cascade of events as obviously this was just Austria versus Serbia, and then the Russians were pretty friendly with the Serbians. They had a sort of alliance, so the Russians jumped in. The Austrians did offer the Serbians the opportunity to sort of get out of it and to placate them, but apparently the terms were extremely unreasonable, deliberately so. They were never going to meet them. So they got on a war footing. The Russians said, well, we're an ally of Serbia. They got involved. The French said, well, we are too, and as did the British. It sort of dominoed out. There's a bit more to it than this, but basically it dominated pretty quickly. The Bulgarians were friendly with the Austrians, the Hungarians, and the Germans, of course, famously. The Germans were allied also with the Austrians. And that's pretty much how it happened. And the next thing you know, you've got yourself a serious world war because one man was shot. That's how it happened. So there you got a photo. So this is early in the First World War, the Battle of Marne. Those are, some of you might recognise, the distinctive German helmets. Those are German soldiers, and that's, September 1914. And they were at that point fighting the French and the British. They were unsuccessful in that particular battle, but they weren't unsuccessful throughout the duration of the war, and they were quite successful on the Western Front and gave the Allies, they were called the Central Axis, and there was the so-called Allies, they gave the Allies a lot of headaches. Okay, so this war got underway, it was brutal, and there was no obvious end in sight. These were lots of nations, powerful nations, and early on, in fact, after even a few years, it was not clear who would win this war. It was sort of a stalemate, even towards 1917, a few years later. Just stepping aside for a second, though, let's think about the British, because they're now involved in this, right? And they've got this aspiration to get the Jews back in the land, but at this point in time, that's obviously, you would think, way down the priority list. They want to win the war. And one of the Zionists they were involved with, Jewish leader, was that man pictured there, which is Chaim Weizmann. And Chaim Weizmann, a lot of us may know him as a Jewish leader and a Zionist, but does anyone know what he also was, what his profession was? He's a biochemist. And he invented an acid, I think I've written it up, the acetone process, that made cordite explosives, which the British wanted. So there's, like all history, it's kind of hard to know exactly what the truth is, but there's certainly theories that the British were heavily incentivised in the middle of World War I to butter up the Jews, particularly Chaim Weizmann, to assist in the war effort, because those explosives were strategically extremely helpful. So, coincidentally or not, around that time, this extremely important declaration was made by the British government, directed to the Jewish leader Rothschild. It's called the Balfour Declaration because he was the British Foreign Secretary at the time, and essentially it was a commitment to finding the Jews a land. It doesn't strictly state where, but it would ultimately, well, it does say, in Palestine, sorry. It does say where. Prior to that, they weren't sure where. They were looking at Uganda and all that sort of thing. But essentially, it is a commitment of the British government to say, we will help you get what you want by way of your homeland. And this was in the middle of World War I, or actually sort of 3/4 of the way through. So put that to the side, but quite a significant development through that war. And as we go back to sort of focus on the war itself, moving on towards 1917, the war, and around when that declaration was made, the war was not going very well for anybody in a way, but it certainly wasn't going well for the British because it was just an absolute mess. If anyone's ever read about World War I, or seen even photographs or pictures, the Western Front, which was along France there, essentially was, people were just dug in for miles and miles and miles, both sides, in trenches. The Germans started using chemical weapons, the Allies allegedly started using them back. There was rats, there was disease, there was just millions of people dying on both sides, and it was a classic stalemate. They just could not get anywhere. It was just a brutal war. And that's a photo of British troops, and I thought it sort of sums up to me, it was around that time period, that sums up to me, what I've read about that war, and that period of that war is people were just getting destroyed, and the British were getting destroyed along with their, particularly their French allies. Okay, so again, remember the context, we're trying to think about the return of the Jews to the land. What has to happen for the Jews to go back into the land? Well, a number of things have to happen, but one of them is the Turks got to get booted out. And I neglected to say the Turks allied with the Germans. Okay, so I should have made that point. So if you're speculating at this point, if you're a student of Bible prophecy, you're saying, well, this doesn't look good, but I think the British are going to have to win this because they're pro-Jewish. The Turks have got to get turfed out, but it doesn't look good because it was a stalemate at best, probably for them. At best, the French were starting to desert at this point en masse. So it was the tide was really against the so-called allies at that time. And so we come to our July 4th friends, the US. US were quite a powerful nation because they'd been selling arms to the British during this period, to the Allies, and they're a big nation at this point, but they were neutral, which, I mean, who can blame them? Like, who would want, who would put up their hand to go across to the Western Front and get brutalised in the trenches, right? So they didn't know at the start it was going to get that bad, but they stayed out of it, which you could say was pretty smart. And they had this, push of towards isolationism and neutrality, and there's just a propaganda poster there that sort of sums up the spirit. That's from 1915. So quite early in the war, there's obviously people with vested interests saying, "Hey, we're out of the war, but don't let people say we're cowards, because we're not afraid of any of them." But you would think that's probably why you wouldn't go to war, isn't it? Because you're afraid to go to war. But they stayed out of it. And they let everyone else fight it out. So again, prophetically, you're looking at this going, well, if only the US would get involved, they were pretty powerful, that would probably swing the pendulum, but they don't want to get involved. And how on earth would anyone get them involved? And this is where it gets kind of interesting. So fairly early on in the war, that's a British ship, the HMS Antrim. The British formed a blockade from England to sort of around Scandinavia, that area, to prevent the Germans getting supplies in, which infuriated the Germans because that made it more difficult for them to wage war. And so in return, the Germans pretty much said, any of your ships in these waters, we've got submarines and we're going to shoot your ships. And they were shooting like passenger ships, everything, anything, cargo ships, and obviously military ships. So it was they pretty much said anything's fair game. Anyone allied to you, we're going to shoot them down. And there was this famous incident where there was this boat called the Lusitania, and the Lusitania was a passenger ship, about 2,000, had about 600 crew and about 1,400 passengers, about 120 of whom were American, and it was voyaging from New York to Liverpool. And the Germans knew about this, and there were theories that, which may have been true, it's not clear, that the Allies were putting explosives and weapons and things in civilian craft to get them through, which would be quite a clever tactic, but not so much if the Germans found out, which they may have. Anyhow, the Germans were aware of this journey was going to take place, and they actually the German embassy in America ran ads in a couple of papers to warn Americans, don't go on that boat because it's going into British waters, and any non-central axis boats in those waters are fair game and we will shoot them. So they ran a paper. Travellers intending to embark on the Atlantic voyage are reminded that a state of war exists between Germany and her allies and Great Britain and her allies, that the zone of war includes the waters adjacent to the British Isles, that in accordance with the formal notice given to us, the Imperial German government, vessels flying the flag of Great Britain or of any of her allies are liable to destruction in those waters, and that travellers sailing in the war zone, and so on. Okay, Imperial German Embassy. So they actually warned people. But they took off nevertheless, and there were quite a few Americans on it nevertheless, and a U-boat torpedoed it, and about 60% of the people on that boat were killed off the coast of Ireland. So that's one thing that occurred. There's a whole string of things that occurred where the Germans really upset the Americans, and slowly but surely they dragged them into the war, which seems insane. But the reason they did this is because the US there was an act passed where they were supplying weapons and supplies to the Allies. So although they were not actively engaged in the war, they were commercially engaged in the war, and it was pretty clear where their loyalties lay, but they just didn't want to actually put their people out there and get killed. So the Germans knew that, they didn't like that, and so they pretty much were hostile towards the Americans. And this incident doesn't highlight that so much, but what did highlight this was what was called the Black Tom incident. So Black Tom is an island, it's a man-made island, it's now just kind of connected to the coast there near New York City. But that's from about 1880, that map. Black Tom became an enormous depot for explosives before they were exported off to the Allies in Europe. And of course, Germans found out about this, and the Germans, this is one of many examples of the Germans pretty much carried out what we would call terrorist attacks. So they sent German spies into this facility and they blew it up. And that's a photo of that at the time. The shrapnel actually flew and struck the statue, damaged the Statue of Liberty, which was just off the water from this. Did a lot of damage. It was about, in those days, $20 million worth of damage. I haven't converted that to today's terms, but I imagine 20 million 120 years ago is I don't know, better part of $1 billion today, wouldn't it? A lot. Killed 4 people, and there was lots of these things. There was quite a few of these. This is probably the most famous one, Black Tom. And, again, that was 1916? Yeah, 1916. So, the Americans are starting to get really angry, the American people, but they still don't want to go into the war. Again, for obvious reasons, I would suggest. And then in 1917, whether this was the straw that broke the horse's back or not, I'm not sure, but there was this telegram from the Germans, and they did ultimately confirm this was legitimate. The British intelligence intercepted this telegram from Germany to Mexico, which was pretty much an offer of an alliance on the basis that the Americans may enter into the war. The Germans pretty much said, we'll be allied with you, and when we beat the Americans, you can have back various lands that you feel they took off you when they colonised the area. Again, there's a political ad. It shows you the state, Arizona, New Mexico, Texas. I think there's another one that they promised. But yeah, so they offered them, they sort of said, look, if you help us, you're going to get some of these great southern states back. But the British intelligence not only intercepted it, but they cracked the code and they told everybody, and then the Germans actually, I don't know why you would do this, because these days you wouldn't be so honest, but they said, yeah, we did do that. And the Foreign Secretary was Zimmerman, so it's called the Zimmerman Telegraph. And this just about was the last straw, because it became pretty clear that Germany was very actively undermining the US and had pretty hostile intent. And so, finally, 7th of December 1917, President Woodrow Wilson declares war. Okay, so the headline, President calls for war declaration, stronger navy, new army of 500,000 men, full cooperation with Germany's foes. Okay, so, and this is December 1917. I mean, the war, we now know, only ran about another year after this. So it's right at the business end of the war. Everybody is just crippled, both sides. And, this is Germany's worst nightmare. So you look in hindsight and think, it wasn't that bright, poking the bear. And of course it happened again. The Japanese were going to do it 20, 30 years later. We'll look at that too. Yeah, we've got a bit of time. So they declared war. They're a big nation. They've got fresh troops. And they started sending about 10,000 troops a day, fresh troops to the Western Front. Apparently it didn't go very well because they were, the other nations learnt the hard way that full frontal charging in trench warfare is just not a good idea, as the Australians learned at Gallipoli. And so there were very heavy casualties for the US. They didn't sort of listen to that, and they just did it. But nevertheless, they ultimately won. They just had the sheer weight of numbers, fresh troops, and they, it's hard to say, but historians certainly feel that the US pretty much decided that war. It was quite decisive. They got involved, and it was over not that long afterwards. So, yeah, so they did have a role in this particular war. I would suggest you That's just a photo of the one of the US divisions on Armistice Day, so 11th November 1918. So yeah, it's not even a year later, it was all over. The Allies had won and the US had played a huge role. Okay, and of course the Turks got toppled. The League of Nations in 1922 on the back of this gave control of Palestine to the British. So it did lead to the dislodging of the Turks and the entry of the British, who we know at this point have already formally committed in writing publicly that they're going to hand, if they can, which they couldn't in 1917, but they can as of 1922, they're going to hand it to the Jews. So just an absolutely perfect setup for what looked, 20 years prior, less than 20 years prior, very unlikely, even 10 years prior, 1912, looked pretty unlikely. Suddenly now it's looking pretty credible. The Jews are going to get the land back. The Turks are done. The British, it's just a matter of time before the British hand it over. But I suggest to you there was still one problem. And it was that there actually, not that many Jews went back, which you could argue pretty strongly would constitute a failure to fulfill the prophecy. So even though on the back of this, the way was paved for the Jews to return to the land, and there's various difficulties around that. Not that many did until after World War II. World War II was the catalyst for massive movements of Jews into the land of Israel. And I just found this interesting. If you look at sort of again, this is a percentage of the Palestinian, the population of the land of Israel that were Jewish. So 1880, late 19th century, sub 10%. Getting into World War I, it was sort of in the 10 to 20 range. Even after World War I, when they know the British have got control and they know it's probably just a matter of time, there was still a general reluctance to go back, 20 to 30%. And then look at the spike. It just goes through the roof. That's World War II. Okay? So, and this is where I sort of look at it and think, well, it sort of flipped to some extent from fishing, sort of a friendly bait, to come back to the land to unfortunately hunting. And the Jews were going to be forcibly removed from Europe, and World War II seems to have been the mechanism that did that. That paved the way for the fulfillment of the prophecy in 1948. So, I think we've all heard of Adolf Hitler. That is, anyone spot Adolf Hitler? Where's Wally? Adolf Hitler is the man with his hand up, I think, saluting the troops. So that's the invasion of Poland. So World War II began, not with quite this, well, I think the same level of strangeness as World War I. It was quite odd how that began. Hitler just had an ideology and he wanted to take over the world, and he had to start with Europe. And in fact, he started with Poland within Europe. And he did ultimately pretty much take over Europe, but he started with Poland and sent in his troops, as you see pictured there. However, I think it's no secret that one of Hitler's, one of the aspects of his worldview that he had promoted in Germany at the time, and that was a feature of the Nazis, was he didn't like a lot of people, but he especially didn't like Jews. He believed in the supremacy of the Aryan race, and he thought the Jews were the extreme opposite, and that they needed to go. As in, they needed to be wiped out. So that, again, if you can't read German, it says it there. That's just a propaganda poster that gives you a view as to the views of the Nazis towards the Germans, the Nazis towards the Jews. They hated them, and even to the point, I found this, I hadn't seen this before, I found this incredible, that they actually blamed the Jews for World War II, which, I guess that's what propaganda's for, but it's quite incredible, because that was not really true, was it? The Jews didn't start World War II, the Nazis did. But yeah, they pretty much demonised Jews, because he had a philosophical view that they were evil and that they were bad people and they were the cause of so many problems in the world. But if you ever want to, they were treading a path that had been trodden before. Lots of nations have tried to wipe out the Jews, but the Bible says you'll never wipe out the Jews. So if you're going to find anyone who can wipe out the Jews, the Bible is wrong, the God of the Bible is false. But good luck, because so many super powerful nations over the entirety of human history that we know of, 5, 6, 7,000 years, have tried to wipe out the Jews and have failed. It's blown up in their face. And Hitler's probably the latest major version of that, where someone has tried to wipe out the Jews and it just blew up in his face. He was never going to succeed because he's fighting God. That's what we'd suggest as Christadelphians. You'd never succeed wiping out the Jews. But he did try to do that. Again, I think a lot of us probably know, they put them in concentration camps, they locked them up, imprisoned them, gassed them to death, tortured, starved, everything. It's a very sad story. Historians believe they murdered about 6 million Jews, the Nazis. So this was all going on, and if you're sort of thinking, well, prior to this, I wonder how the Jews are going to get lured out of Europe and the rest of the world, particularly Europe, back into the land. Well, you kind of had your answer at this point, I would suggest. But now there's another problem in terms of fulfilling prophecy, which is Hitler was extremely successful militarily. Hitler did take over the entirety of Europe. He had the Japanese allied to him. They had a massive foothold in due time in the region we live in, Asia. The Italians weren't quite as militarily impressive, but they had parts in North Africa. And that group of 3 nations were extremely powerful. They were extremely militarily successful, and they looked at various points completely unstoppable. So again, you look at this from the point of view of a Bible student, and if you're in the middle of this, you're thinking, okay, I can see, well, all right, well, this looks pretty ugly, but I can see how some Jews will want to go back to the land now. I can see how it's potentially, the world might actually allow the Jews to have their own nation, which they did in 1948. But that's only if Hitler gets defeated. How on earth is Hitler going to get defeated? Because that looks pretty unlikely. Around 1942, 3, 4, it looked pretty unlikely. And again, let's think about the US. Where was the US? The US did not participate in World War II at the beginning. They did not, similar reasons to the first time. But in fact, they had an even stronger case now, because they could point back to World War I and say, look at that mess, we're not going to do that again. We're not going to get involved in other people's wars. They lost 116,000 people, and they only got involved at the end. They got absolutely destroyed. They won the war, but they got wrecked. And so they had this sort of isolationist movement, quite a lot of formal movements that were making sure, lobbying to ensure that the American government did not do that again. They did not get involved. Okay? But as a Bible student, you're going, well, I'm pretty sure Hitler can't win this, but it looks like he's going to win this. What's going to happen? The US don't want. The US could probably swing it, maybe just, but they don't want to get involved. They had, there's Miss Goldie Dunn and Miss Louise Hyatt, National Council for the Prevention of War. So this was common. There was massive organised lobby groups, and they were quite successful, and they did not want war. And one of the this is quite interesting, but one of the arguments put forward was absolutely World War I. And it wasn't just the loss of troops in combat in that short 11-month period. It was the Spanish flu, because the war became a breeding ground for the Spanish flu. And the Spanish flu, it's kind of topical. We've got COVID. We couldn't sing a hymn because of COVID. COVID's nothing compared to the, hopefully it never is, but it's nothing compared to the Spanish flu. The Spanish flu killed, it's estimated about there's lots of different numbers, up to 100 million, but 20 to 50 million people, killed tens of millions of people. And one of the catalysts for it was World War I, because various reasons. You had soldiers stuck on ships, they're moving between countries, the ships are obviously very confined, so one person gets it, the whole ship gets it. They're then going to military hospitals, which are also, so there's an example of one there, which are extremely congested, and it just spread like wildfire. And World War I was absolutely to a large extent to blame. It also didn't help that, does anyone know why it's called the Spanish flu, actually? Yes, Nikki. Yep. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, it's called the Spanish flu. It had nothing to do with coming out of Spain. It's because the Spanish were neutral. So almost every nation was in World War I. The Spanish were not. Sort of like the Swiss today, I guess. They're pretty neutral. And so they would actually report it in the media, and no one else would report it because they didn't want to deflate morale, the troop morale, because they're at a really important critical stage of the war. Anything could have tipped it. So yeah, it's called the Spanish flu erroneously because they reported honestly, because they didn't care about troop morale because they had no troops in the war. So that's interesting. But yeah, correctly, people drew an association between World War I and the devastation that came out of the Spanish flu. And it absolutely killed a lot of people in the States. So they had compelling reasons to stay out, and were successfully staying out for quite some time. However, very similar to World War I, the parallels are incredible between World War I and World War II in terms of a few things, but particularly the US. There's President Roosevelt, March 1941, so the war's been going on for a couple of years at this point, not involved, but that he signed this bill called the Lease bill because, again, they did have sympathies towards a certain side, and it was the British side. It was the non-Nazi side. And so what the Lease bill did is it allowed them, exactly like they did in the First World War, to supply goods, weapons, fighter planes to the Allies. So they were neutral, but they weren't neutral. They were neutral. I mean, it's sort of too good to be true, right? So they have their views on who they'd like to win the war, but they don't risk the lives of their sons and daughters, and so that's what they did, and they get rich while doing it because they're selling nothing makes you more money than selling arms. So they did this quite successfully, but there was a problem with Japan. So that photo there is called the Nanjing Massacre, or Nanjing, 1937. So this is before the World War II started in 1939. But there was trouble brewing for quite a while between the Japanese and US. And it centered around, Japan wanted to expand its influence. It had these imperialistic tendencies, didn't have a lot of natural resources, so they decided to invade China, Manchuria. They did that successfully. And then sometime later, there was this, 1937, there was this famous massacre at Nanjing, where they just murdered a lot of Chinese people. I didn't actually see a figure, but apparently it was covered worldwide in the media, and it was considered absolutely brutal what they did. And so the US, in response to that, put sanctions on Japan, quite severe trade sanctions, embargo, which is hard for a nation which doesn't have a lot of natural resources. So importation of oil and various goods and that sort of thing. So this was quite destructive to the Japanese. They were, of course, participating in World War II, and it became quite difficult for them, these embargoes. So in a way, sanctions are like a soft act of war, but you can argue they're an act of war. So, but the US are still at peace. They're still out of the war officially, and the theory goes that the Japanese looked at the situation. They felt there was a certain inevitability about the Americans perhaps getting involved in the war. They looked at their Navy fleet, and they looked at the US's Navy fleet, and they assessed that they would not be successful if there was a prolonged naval warfare between the two nations. So they did the logical thing, and they said, we've got to knock off the better part of their Navy in a surprise attack. So they declared war. They didn't declare war till after they'd attacked, which was a war crime. And I think it took about a day for the message to get through, so the story goes. So essentially they committed a war crime by attacking a nation that was at peace with them in what was, I think most of us would have heard of, this Pearl Harbor incident, which is the US naval base in the Pacific in Hawaii, in fact. So they had all their their ships there, the US. Japanese came in with Zeros, they bombed them, they torpedoed them, submarines, and they did quite a lot of damage. And this, of course, was the catalyst for the US getting involved in the war, which, you know, it's understandable. They killed a lot of US servicemen, but they didn't quite do enough damage in hindsight. Because again, if the Japanese had followed through, they attacked in one wave, and they didn't go back for a second round. They thought, you know, it was too good to be true. We'll probably get hammered if we go back, which they wouldn't have. They didn't go back. So they didn't really finish off the US Navy. They didn't attack the repair bays. They didn't attack the fuel areas. They didn't attack the submarine dock. So they did a lot of damage, but they left a lot behind. And of course, the US, particularly the repair docks, they were able to recover. They did lose some ships, but they also repaired some ships. And yeah, that strategic error of not going back and finishing off the US was a big mistake. You know, most war historians suggest. So, still in Nanjing. Yeah, that's a shot. It's a Japanese shot as they came in and were bombing the US Arizona and various other boats there. So this, as I said, Roosevelt. See, here we've got Roosevelt signing another document. There wasn't a Lend-Lease agreement this time. It was the Declaration of War against Japan. Was it 8th of December? Yeah, 8th of December 1941. He looks considerably less happy than the last photo. And then 3 days after that, Hitler, of course, who is allied with Japan, he has to declare war against the US on the 11th. So now it is all-out war. It already was, but the USA are involved, and the USA were a big beast. We know they've gone on to become even bigger militarily. But this was perhaps, you know, you could argue not the best move by the Japanese. Who knows what would have happened if they hadn't done that. But they did it, the US got involved. And again, you could argue a very strong case to say this decided the war, because the pendulum at this point swung in favour of probably the Allies, or went to neutral at least, and that they were struggling prior to this. So fast forwarding, I won't go through all the details of World War II, but just a few sort of key events that the US were involved in. The US got involved in the war in the Pacific, the Battle of Midway, where they wiped out a lot of the Japanese Navy. And they had this tactic of, they realised that as they started to pick off small islands in the Pacific and head up towards Japan, and they realised that if they got close enough, they could build an airstrip and they could send bombers off from these little islands and drop bombs on the Japanese. And so they started to pick off these islands, and there's the Mariana Islands in hindsight were the critical islands, because the Mariana Islands are Guam, Saipan, and Tinian. They became sites, Tinian and Saipan became sites where they would construct in about a year big airstrips that could handle B-29 bombers, and B-29 bombers were capable of carrying atom bombs. So, well, that's 1944, so that's the middle of 1944, just hold that thought. Just prior to that, the other thing the US did that was very significant in the war is they didn't do this alone, but they participated with the French, not the French, the Canadians and the British in Operation Overlord or D-Day, where they famously stormed the beaches at Normandy. The Allies knew that they ultimately had to get a foothold in Europe. That was the stronghold of the Nazis. As much as the Nazis wanted to get a foothold in England, and they couldn't get through with their bombing campaigns and such. The Allies realised that, again, if they wanted to avoid a stalemate, they had to ultimately get to Germany. They had to get a foothold in Western Europe, and so they planned this invasion of Normandy, and they stormed 5 beaches in rafts and such. There was bombardment. There was paratroopers dropped, which was apparently very unsuccessful. Then ultimately they sent people in, and some of the this was a brutal campaign, and I think Omaha Beach was one of the beaches. It's not called Omaha Beach; they just codenamed it that. They called it Omaha Beach, and the US troops predominantly landed there, and they got absolutely destroyed. About 90% of them were killed. You can see that barge there. So that's an actual photo what would happen is heaps of soldiers landed. It was a mass landing. They'd come up, these barge doors would drop, and there's about 20, 30 men, soldiers in these barges, and the German machine guns would put up on the hilltops, the cliffs, in pillboxes. These machine guns they had, I can't remember the name of the machine guns, but they could fire about 20 rounds a second. So in about 2 seconds, 3 seconds, they just shot everyone in the barge. As soon as the door dropped, they'd just shoot them. So it was an absolute bloodbath. But ultimately, enough of a percentage of troops got through. They set explosives under the pillboxes, and they got all the Germans out. But a brutal, brutal battle. But the Americans did play a big role in that as well. Okay, and on the back of that, I mean, sometime later, 1945, about a year later, they did actually, they slowly crept in on Berlin, and they eventually took Europe. But they didn't actually take Japan at that point. So V-Day, or Victory Day, was 8th of May 45, and it wasn't until August that they finished off the Japanese, which is a couple of months later, because they did exactly as planned. They built those air bases on Saipan and Tinian. They sent a plane, a B-29 bomber called the Enola Gay, which you can go and look at in Washington. It's in the US Air Space Museum. But yeah, they sent the Enola Gay, and it was actually over two raids. They bombed Hiroshima and Nagasaki and killed about 100 to 200,000 people, mostly civilians. And that was the end of the Japanese participation in the war. So yes, the US played an enormous role in the ending of World War II. Obviously, a very brutal affair, and we're not here to endorse war. We're certainly not interested in that as Christadelphians, but it's just history. And it's interesting to look at the history, and as we're doing today, we're putting a bit of a lens on the Americans, and to see how different nations, perhaps to varying degrees, were used by God to bring about his plan and his purpose. Because he had said thousands of years ago, the Jews would go back. On the back of this, this is the last slide, 1948. On the back of this, the Jews ultimately were granted nationhood. That's David Ben-Gurion, their first, Prime Minister, I think. It was all on the back of, 48. Back in 1910, it looked completely unlikely. So 40 years later, the world has flipped on its head. The Turks are gone. The Jews have been ripped out of Europe, unfortunately, sadly. But these seemingly almost unwinnable wars, especially World War II, were ultimately won by the people God wanted to win at the time he wanted them to win, probably. And so the Jews found themselves a nation in the land of Israel. So it's just interesting to look at the history. It's interesting to look at today, July 4th, the role the Americans played. But as I said, it's not that God said he would do it with the Americans. We can just look back and see these amazing events, which personally I see the signature of God on. I see God choreographing these things to varying degrees to bring about exactly what he has said in his word. He always said Israel would get scattered. They were. He always said they'd be put back in that land, and they were. And as I said, even as little as 40 years prior, it looked extremely unlikely. Extremely unlikely. They didn't even want it themselves. They weren't even interested. So how do you sort that out? Well, history played out, and they're back in the land as of 1948. They're still there, and for that reason, we would suggest to you that it's just one of many Bible prophecies that are extremely accurate, extremely reliable, and if we just give them a little bit of our focus and a little bit of our time and do our own research, don't trust what I'm saying, go away and spend the time and the effort and look at it yourself, I think you'll find the Bible is a very trustworthy and reliable book, and one that absolutely deserves our attention. Okay, thank you.